Hello everyone, welcome to the third episode of Highlander, the show where we talk about every single legendary card in Hearthstone. I'm joined as always by my good friend and co-host Jamie. How you doing, Jamie?
I'm alright, thanks, James. Hello everybody.
I'm James, telling you to sit back and relax as we talk about some more cards. Right, we've got a lot to cover today, so let's just crack on with Nat Pagle. 2 mana 0/4. At the start of your turn, you've got a 50% chance to draw an extra card. So this card used to read a little differently in that its effect used to trigger at the end of your turn and not the start. And this little change has made quite a big difference.
It used to be played in basically every deck. 4 health on turn 2 is pretty good. It was very hard for most classes to remove, so it usually stuck around for at least 2 chances to draw, which generally made it worth it. Like as the game hit full release was when it got changed.
I'm sure it was lots of different events that people were complaining about, but one particular event that I could find was an event called Fight Night that used to occur back in beta. Are you aware of this?
I know of it. I'm not particularly well versed in it though.
This used to be like a casual tournament between 2 teams, and one of the teams in this tournament got absolutely shafted by RNG. Nat drew far more cards for one team than the other. There's an old quote by Ben Broad saying that with Tinkmaster, for example, you've got to always consider the risk of whether you can deal with the opponent's minion being transformed into a 5/5. But with Nat, there really was no way to play around it, obviously, because of the card effects being what it is. So Blizzard decided to change it to at the start of your turn, and this has resulted in a completely unplayable card.
It gives the opponent a full turn to trade in or remove Nat. As you say, it's now one of the prime tier joke cards in the game, unplayable.
I can't think of a way that you would change Nat to actually make him good.
Not in its current state. Like, not even with its current effect. There's nothing.
I feel like the only way to do it would be to revert the effect and just lower his health to make it easier to deal with, but I really don't like it because of the fact that a 1-card advantage is a massive deal, especially at the early stages of the game, and that's so swingy.
But the way the game's sped up now, I don't think it would be as big of a problem if it was reverted, because it's much easier for decks now in both formats to deal with Nat, especially with the fact that he has 0 attack. We can just trade him off. I don't think it would be a massive problem if it was reverted. I mean, obviously, you'd have to test it, but I think it might be reasonable.
I guess it's just, I don't really like this really swingy RNG at the start. I mean, you make a good point actually, because I'm thinking of, for example, in Wild, thinking of Odd Demon Hunter. Their ideal turn is turn 1, play a Battle Fiend, and then turn 2, Hero Power, which in Wild, Odd Demon Hunter does 2 damage.
That's 4 damage straight away.
Yeah, and he may not even draw you a card, he's just going to soak up 4 damage.
Yeah.
I think the other thing about it is the fact that, for example, Shamanus Manatide Totem. Now, Blizzard has explicitly said that they don't want class cards to be worse than neutral cards, right? Because they want the classes to have their own identity. So if you make Nat back to his old effect, is he just better than Manatide Totem? And do they just play that instead? I'm not sure, really.
Manatide Totem's got the consistency, though. Like, you always know it's going to replace itself.
I know, that's very true. The card needs changing. At the moment, it is completely unplayable. You know, assuming that your opponent doesn't kill it, it may not even draw you a card. It's a bad card. Let's go on to a new one. Onyxia, 9 mana, 8/8 dragon. Battle cry, fill your side of the board with whelps. Whelps are 1/1 dragons, by the way. Do you want to start? Because I've got a few things to say, but my knowledge of it in the meta is a little bit piecemeal.
I was going to say, just, it's another poor card, really. There isn't much to say about it in the meta. I think it saw a bit of play in, like, Token Druid.
Yep.
Back in a long time ago.
This is back in Whispers of the Old Gods, and it was sometimes run instead of Cenarius in the 9-drop slot. You know, with the understanding that, well, it's stronger than Cenarius when you don't have a board set up, but obviously weaker when you do because you can't buff your own minions. Aside from that, and like a couple of ramp druid lists in the early days of the game, I just cannot find anyone running this card.
Yeah,
the only time I ever see it is off of RNG. You know, we've been playing this game for quite a long time. Like, you would have thought someone would find a use for it, but nope.
It's very hard for 9 mana cards to see play, like proactive cards like this.
I think Cenarius is a better card. It's slightly more proactive. At least the traits that you might summon have taunt, and that barely sees any play.
It's defensive, and the Onyxia's got no defensive capabilities. It's just a bunch of stats.
Exactly.
It's very, very good in Arena, and it's also very good in the miniature tavern brawl where everything costs 1 in mana and is a 1/1.
Oh, it's good off Bandersmash as well.
It's quite often an okay pick-off of the Dragon Lackey if you need a bit of top end.
Well, it's like we said about Deathwing, isn't it? It's like
a
lot of these cards that never see any play, you actually see quite a lot of because of the bloody Dragon Lackey. I'll tell you one list that I have seen Onyxia played in very, very briefly. You know, back in Ungoro,
Yeah.
this was a list which was Murloc Paladin with the Curator, and you would use it to draw your Onyxia because it was the only dragon in your deck, and you'd also draw your Murlocs with it, and you could draw the 4-mana 5/4 beasts.
Yeah, Megasoft. That makes sense. Nothing better to play, essentially, in the dragon slot. Murloc Paladin in Ungoro was firmly tier 1, so that's interesting.
Some people use Deathwing in that slot, or any just big proactive dragon like Alexstrasza, but Onyxia certainly makes sense. I can kind of see it there.
I think Onyxia is very suited to a board flood deck compared to Deathwing or Alexstrasza.
Especially when you've got Tarim as well, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I cannot find any other lists with her. What could you fix about Onyxia to make it more playable?
It'd have to go down quite a lot, I think. Go down to 7, maybe. And even then, it's just a bunch of stats.
I think it'd be too good at 7 for standard, to be honest. I mean, think about Dr. Boom, right? That's 7-mana 7/7 with 2 boom bots.
I don't think standard would play that, though. I'm not convinced. Demon Hunter will just kill you by the time you get to playing a 7-mana 8/8 that someone's. You need something with some sort of removal or taunt or something.
Yeah, okay. Maybe you could give the whelps rush or taunt or something like that. That would be some sort of consideration.
Yeah, I don't like reducing the cost anyway. I don't think that's a very elegant way of doing it, but I think giving the Onyxia body rush would be quite good.
Because that could have some flavour as well, because it's like it's protecting the whelps.
Yeah. Either way, give one of the 2 rush. I think that would actually have a bit of utility, because at least it's affecting the board immediately.
Needless to say, like I've said with Cenarius, this card will never see playing wild. I mean, Cenarius sees occasional playing standard, with the quest, and that's just a lot of stats. Maybe there is a deck for Onyxia if they introduce some more dragon synergies, which, they just had an entire expansion for that.
But again, Cenarius has taunt, and it's more stats. It just seems like it's a struggle to me.
Right, should we talk about a different card?
Well, it's about time.
Right then, Nozdormu, 9-mana 8/8 dragon. Each player only has 15 seconds to take their turn. In my notes, I've got one of those cards Blizzard wishes it could just delete.
Yeah, it's not good, but it's problematic, that's for sure. It's completely broken, and we're not talking about in the power sense.
Every year or so, it seems, people always find ways to stretch the animation length to just over 15 seconds and skip your opponent's turn. So I think the first one I've ever seen was Youthful Brewmaster on a minion, and then you Youthful Brewmaster that thing, and then just do it over and over again. So you do it about 4 or 5 times in a turn, and that animation length causes your opponent to skip their turn, and then you can just do it again because you've got the Brewmaster back in your hand and just keep hitting them in the face with the Nozdormu body. So that was quite a famous one. Do you know about any? Because I've got quite a few written down here.
Yeah, well, there's obviously the Joust one.
Oh, yes.
Which was a legitimate thing at some point.
Yeah.
Which was the TGT mechanic Joust has a very, very long animation.
Yep.
And if you played Nozdormu with some Joust cards, your opponents would always skip the turn.
Another one was Curse of Reform.
Yeah.
So if you're playing Warlock, you can play this card called Curse of Reform, which puts a curse in your opponent's hand. It's a spell that they have to play to stop taking damage at the start of the turn. It's not very good, but it does cause an animation to happen at the start of their turn. So if you play 2 Curse of Reforms and Nozdormu, you essentially make the animations last their entire turn, and then you just hit them with Nozdormu. And then the same thing happens again, where the animations take up their turn because these curse cards are still in their hand. So then you just keep hitting them with Nozdormu.
More recently, there's been a very relevant one, which was Ysera Unleashed.
Oh, yeah.
much to the vitriol of everybody, if the dream portals summoned an Nozdormu, because they got like a few of them, that was it. There goes the opponent's turn. Which is just, yeah, I mean, that's not great, really.
It's not, especially because all of the other ones that we've suggested so far, you'd have to be playing a terrible, terrible deck to actually skip their turn.
Yeah.
But this is something that very often happens, especially in Standard, where the Dragon Pool is so much smaller.
Ysera's a good card that a lot of Druid decks play. One thing I would say about Nozdormu that's really interesting is it's got advantages against certain types of players. So if someone's playing on an old computer or like a mobile, getting Nozdormu, that's lag central.
Yeah.
It's also very good against bots for what it's worth.
Another really common one right now is with Plot Twist.
Yeah.
So Plot Twist animation is notoriously long anyway, especially when occasionally it freezes for a few seconds.
Occasionally. I mean, I think it feels like every time. I'm pretty sure it never used to freeze for 5 seconds and make you think that the game had crashed.
Because they changed a lot of the Unity code recently, didn't they?
To my knowledge, yeah.
That's quite an infamous one right now. To the point where Blizzard has said that they're planning on doing a larger scale change to Nozdormu to avoid these sort of issues happening again.
Another thing to say is that Nozdormu's relatively common off of Dragon Lackey as well, which means that the classic pretend you're AFK strategy comes in. So you wait the whole turn, hope your opponent's like dozing off, and then play everything you're going to do on Nozdormu and just try and catch them out.
Fantastic.
If you're playing against somebody who ropes most of his turns, like Trump, for example.
Nozdormu, to my knowledge, is the only card that has like a persistent environmental effect. Now, there's an interesting video where someone summons 14 Nozdormu at the same time, and the effects stack on top of... Have you seen this?
I don't think so, no.
Let me find a link for you. Oh, here we go. Right, I found it. I'm just going to send you it now.
That's awful. It's just, well, brilliant. I mean, that's... But you have to appreciate the effort, don't you? The advantage of having a digital card game is the fact that you can pull off cards like Nozdormu. It's what makes it a great platform.
There is just something about it which you can't do in Magic, right? Because how are you going to do it in Magic? Do you just get an egg timer and just... Because it's not the same, is it? Do you just throw sand onto the board? Like, you can't do that. Xavius, 6 mana, 7/5 demon. After you play a card, summon a 2/1 Satyr, which is also a demon, by the way.
Well, Xavius is rubbish. It's not the card we want to talk about.
The one that we want to talk about is Illidan.
I'm sure everybody knows this, but with the introduction of the 10th class Demon Hunter, the card Illidan Stormrage was replaced with Xavius, which is a different character, essentially. As it turns out, what they did by doing that is removed all of the interesting things to talk about with the card.
It's got nothing to do with WoW lore. And we should probably say that in the whole of this podcast, in case you haven't guessed by being 3 episodes in, me and Jamie do not care about Warcraft lore. But the interesting thing was that the fact that when they changed it to Xavius, they changed the card effect very slightly to after you play a card, not when you play a card. So, if you have Illidan and Knife Juggler on the board, what happens is, when you play a card, a token is summoned first, and then Knife Juggler, which throws a knife, or deals 1 damage to a random enemy, throws a knife. And then, the card's effect occurs. For example, if you were to play Illidan, Knife Juggler, and your opponent has, 3 explosive sheep on their side of the board. These are minions, by the way, which are 1/1s, and Death Rattle deal 2 damage to all minions. And then you were to play Brawl, for example. Illidan's going to summon a minion. Knife Juggler's going to throw a knife. Let's say it hits one of the explosive sheep. So all 3 explosive sheep detonate, dealing 6 damage to the entire board and completely wiping out the board. But Brawl hasn't activated yet. So now Brawl activates, and you get the big dust cloud of Brawl. But it never ends. And no minion pops out of Brawl because nothing went into it. And you can't actually concede from this point.
It completely soft locks the game permanently.
Right, because you're not supposed to be able to play Brawl while there are no minions. And you didn't. You didn't break it. I mean, you didn't mean to, but you did.
My personal favourite, and there's a lot of things you can do with this specific interaction, is if you do the setup and then Knife Juggler kills Sylvanas, which then will steal the card. Let's say it's the card that you played, and you played a battle cry card, like, for example, Jaraxxus. The Juggler activates, killing Sylvanas. That'll steal your Jaraxxus, but then the Jaraxxus battle cry goes off for your opponent, which turns them into Jaraxxus. So this was a stupid combo you could do where you set up like that and then sacrificial pact to the opponent after you turn them into Jaraxxus.
My other Jaraxxus Illidan interaction is the one where you... I'm just trying to remember it all now because it's so convoluted. But you have the minion from Naxxramas, which is a 4-mana 5/5. Death Rattle, return one of your friendly minions to your hand.
Anubar Ambusher.
Right. So what you do is the same thing with the sheep again. Let's say there's 3 sheep, for example. So you play Jaraxxus, your token gets summoned, Knife Juggler hits one of the sheep, your entire board gets wiped except for Jaraxxus. And now, because this is the way the ordering works in Hearthstone, the Death Rattle of your Ambusher occurs, and now, instead of transforming into Jaraxxus is actually returned to your hand. But if in this interaction you happen to draw a card, for example, if a Loot Hoarder was on the board, right, or Blood Mage Falnos or something like that, you actually get an 11th card in your hand, and that being Jaraxxus, right? And to top it all off, if you emote at this point, so you say well played, your emotes will be Jaraxxus emotes, but they'll be coming from the card at the right of your hand. It's just so bizarre, but it's just one of the weird things you can do with this combo.
My personal favourite as well, aside from that one, is the interaction with Mind Control.
Oh, yes.
If you have Mind Control something, but then in the process, the card that you try and Mind Control is returned to your opponent's hand with something like them having an ambusher, still Mind Control, take control of the card, except it'll take control hand to hand, so it'll put that card in your hand, even if you have the maximum amount of cards in hand. So again, you'll be able to go up to 11 cards.
As for how good Illidan actually is in the game, he's not very. It should be fairly obvious why, but the fact is that Illidan just dies so easily. His body is so frail.
Yeah.
So even if you get to turn 6 and play him,
yeah,
your opponent is 9 times out of 10 just going to be able to kill him, just like that.
It's hard to play enough cards to make enough tokens to make it actually worth putting him in the deck.
That's another thing as well.
And again, it's just a bunch of stats. It doesn't do anything. It's not like it's 2/1s with Rush or something.
I mean, consider a card like Violet Teacher. So this is a 4-mana 3/5. Every time you cast a spell, summon a 1/1 token, right? Now, this comes out 2 turns earlier. And although the tokens are slightly weaker because they're 1/1s instead of 2/1s, and you can't just summon minions to trigger the effect, you can change spells much more easily. For example, you're using Raven Idols or Pounce or Counterfeit Coins or something like that. You're not putting a body on board that is also going to clog up the amount of tokens you can actually summon.
Yeah.
That card is so much better than Illidan or Xavius or whatever you want to call him. And that came out in the same set. It got power crept in the same set.
Violet Teacher still sees no play and hasn't done for a while, honestly.
Exactly. A lot of these cards have some sort of niche use. For example, Nozdormu is an absolutely terrible card, but at least it's got the cool time-skipping effects, and it's got the cool sandstorm effects and stuff like that. That's something to make the card memorable. Whereas Xavius, the card, is absolutely forgettable and completely useless. The only way it would ever have any use is if they buffed it. The fact that they've just reworked a card that was in the game for years and all they've done is remove the one interesting thing about it leads me to believe that the card is probably just going to stay as it is forever. I will say the one time that I've seen someone use it in a serious list was a list by... Have you heard of the player called Frodan?
Frodan. He's a good player, but he's a caster.
Yeah. Well, this is back when it was Yogg Druid, but he ran a Token Druid list. And he was using Illidan as like a third Violet Teacher, you can think of it as. You can kind of see why he would do that, but I just think there are better inclusions, you know?
Yeah.
There's a reason. That's the only list I could find of it in.
I don't think that's optimal even then. The other thing to say about Illidan is its effect back at the very start of the game.
The first version of him that was in Hearthstone was a 7-mana 7/7 battle cry. Both players discard 3 cards and draw 3 cards. Now, there is no way to make your opponent discard cards outside of Howl Fiend and Treachery and then some combo like that. This is just on a minion. There is no setup required. It's a good stat line. And yeah, you discard your own cards, but you also get to choose when you discard them. So you could have no cards in hand and just draw a few and then discard your opponent's combo pieces. It's a bit silly. It sees no play right now. Should we put it to its original state?
No. God, no. It's one of the most broken effects anything's ever had in the game. The amount of premium you have to pay on discarding cards out of the opponent's hand. Like, you have to do a whole Treachery and Howlfiend setup, and even then, you're getting no stats for that. And this is just a 7/7 for 7. Like you said, if you've got no cards in hand or one card in hand, it's just an F plus 3 or 2 or whatever.
If we consider that this card essentially, you're playing it with an empty hand because you're playing a tempo deck, it's essentially 7 mana, 7/7, draw 3 cards. And then consider something like Valadris Fellforge, right? 7 mana, 4/4, draw 4 cards, increase your hand size, whatever. It's completely busted. Absolutely busted wide up. Let's not even talk about the bloody discard effects, which are also completely insane.
If you remove the effect that it affects the opponent, it'd still be incredible. Like, 7 mana, 7/7 battle cry, you discard 3 and draw 3. That's an exceptionally powerful card in and of itself.
It's ultimately, in effect, not made for Hearthstone because there is just no way to recover those cards back. Even if they changed the amount of cards it discarded to like 1, it's just so swingy and silly that you couldn't possibly have it in Hearthstone. It's just completely incompatible with the game.
See, as a Yu-Gi-Oh player, hand looping is a massive no-no. Discarding cards out of the opponent's hand is the most sought after and highest premium effect probably in the game. And the vast majority of cards or decks that have ever been able to consistently discard cards out of the opponent's hand have been completely banned. Discarding cards out of the opponent's hand isn't good in any circumstance, really.
At least it'd see play.
Wow. It's the fact that it's just good stats as well. I find it interesting how off the mark they were when they originally designed it.
Starving Buzzard. You consider that card, right? Like how far off the mark they were with that.
Oh, yeah, I mean...
Oh, dear. I mean, there's just so many. Or the original, like, Warsong Commander.
Well, my nemesis, Undertaker, as well.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you could go and say the entire Demon Hunter class anyway, but we won't mention that.
Skull of Gul'dan, that's that one in particular. Imagine how good our Demon Hunter would be with 5 mana Skull.
This just shows how interested we are in Xavier, isn't it? Like we're talking about a completely different class. And
Well, I think we covered Xavier's pretty well, to be fair. We said there's nothing interesting to say about him, so we just cut it out.
I'm just gonna have to look him up as well because I can't remember the name of his son.
Bane.
Ah, yes.
So talking like this, like I'm not speaking to a man.
Cairne Bloodhoof, 6 mana, 4/5, Death Rattle, summon a 4/5 Bane Bloodhoof. Jamie, on whereabouts on the power level do you put Cairne?
Nowadays, medium to low, but no, I suppose relative to the rest of the classic set, neutrals, it's quite good. But he's not seen play for a while. There was a time where he was played a lot.
I've got this card written down as the Cutting Room Floor card because if you search for this card in like, I don't know, r/competitive Hearthstone or something like that, a lot of decklist guides either say I started with the card and ended up cutting it because it was too slow, or they say it's a consideration if you run into more control and need the value, but it's never actually in the list. It's always as like, I tried it, it didn't work, or it's a consideration. And that tells me something very worrying about the card, and the fact is it's just really, really, really slow, and it's just a bunch of stats. It's another card that's a bunch of stats.
It's a classic set for you.
Yeah.
Like, the game was so much slower. Bunches of stats were just most of the cards, like Yeti, Ogre, Cairne. Doesn't really do anything, but...
I mean, it's still quite efficient for the cost as well. I mean...
Oh, it does. It's what's an 8/10 that protects against board cutters. I've always liked the card. I think it's solid. It's reliable, right? But it's not exciting, and it's not going to see play at the moment because it's not proactive enough. Well, should I say it doesn't do anything immediately?
That's right. It doesn't have what Sludge Belcher or Cartut Defender have always had, and that's just taunt.
Yeah.
And that stickiness. Whereas Cairne is just more stats, but that's not really what you want, especially now. The card did see quite a bit of play at the start of the game, because as we've said, stats were good. Control Paladin, would play him quite frequently. Ramp Druid is just another thing to ramp to, especially because it's quite sticky. Control Warrior as well. So those decks all sort of played him a fair bit. And there are other decks that he pops up in from time to time.
You saw quite a lot of play in N'Zoth decks.
Yes. This is kind of the ultimate fate of Death Rattle minions, isn't it? Is it good enough to see playing in a N'Zoth deck? And
yeah,
from when N'Zoth was released in Whispers of the Old Gods, Cairne was quite frequently in those decks. So, for example, N'Zoth Paladin, he's like a staple in that deck. You know, the whole time that N'Zoth is in the meta, he's like always a consideration alongside Tyrion and
yeah, absolutely.
Whatever neutral taunts are in the game at that point. That's one situation where you see him played. Some other decks include like Ungoro, mid-range Paladin sometimes used him, but really it's like a fringe decision. Just because he's kind of good on 6.
Yeah.
I think the most amount of play that I've seen him used in was in Knights of the Frozen Throne. Tempo Rogue was one of the best decks in that format, and Cairne was very, very frequently run in Tempo Rogue, especially in Standard.
So, I have some personal experience with this. In Knights of the Frozen Throne, essentially the only deck I played was Tempo Rogue. I crafted Cairne for Tempo Rogue to curve into Bone Mare.
Did you think it was good enough?
It was optimal. It was very good. Like Cairne on 6 into Bone Mare on 7, and it pretty much always survived to give a 4 or 5. So it was, it was very good. So I had probably about 200 games with Tempo Rogue, of which half of those were probably with Cairne. That deck was completely board focused, and it was very much about curving out. So it was about just slamming whatever the biggest amount of stats you could were at any point. And the main late game power play was the Bone Mare, and it was like a complete staple in neutral Stone, as it was with Keleseth and Scalebane and Chain Gang and all of the classics. But the thing the deck really lacked was a 6-drop. And I tried a bunch of 6-drops until I finally caved in and crafted Cairne.
What other 6-drops did you try?
Do you know, I can't even remember.
Ogre?
No, I genuinely, I think I played a few games with Ogre, and it was okay, but it wasn't. So yeah, I just ended up playing Cairne. And like I said, good card in that deck. Since then, it's not really seen any play from what I can gather.
No.
I've barely ever played against it since.
The only deck I can really think of is like Reincarnate Shaman and
Big Shaman's actually really good in Wild at the moment. I was playing some earlier today, and it's very good. Cairne wouldn't get near it.
Why play Cairne when you can cheat out a Scrapyard Colossus? Something you said in the first episode about Baron Geddon really sort of struck a chord with me. Baron seems like a card designed at the start of the game, and Cairne is exactly the same in that it just feels like a card from 2013 and 14. Do you know?
That's true for a lot of the classic set. Like Onyxia is the same.
Yep.
There's a card that's sort of power crept Cairne. It's common that came out in Ashes of Outland. Do you know about it?
Oh yeah, I remember this card. Yeah.
Dragonmaw Skystalker, which is a 6-mana 5/6 dragon, Death Rattle summon a 3/4. Now, I think this is better than Cairne.
Yeah.
It's front-loaded, so it's more pressure on the board, and it's a dragon, so it's got good synergy.
Yeah. I think there's no question really as to which one's better, especially because in Standard there are so few ways to trigger Death Rattles. You know, it's not like you've got Play Dead or Feign Death in Hunter, for example, where you've got a minion and you're just trying to trigger the Death Rattle as many times as you can.
Yeah, a 5/6 is better than a 4/5. What I think is odd is the fact that it's exactly the same amount of stats. It's 8/10. It's not even like it's slightly less attack or health or something. It's just identical. Of all the cards that I thought would be power crept, Cairne wasn't one of them, to be honest. Specifically in the neutral set. Class cards, obviously, High Main's way better than Cairne, but it's the only legendary you can put 2 of in a deck. There's a classic for you.
Can't wait to talk about High Main. I didn't see him on the list, but I'll put him on. Yeah. Prophet Velen, 7 mana, 7/7 priest legendary. Double the damage and healing of your hero power and spells. So I really like looking at the class cards because you kind of get to see what Blizzard think of the class identities from day one, right? So we've already seen with King Crush, as you so elegantly put it, that it's so fitting with Hunter, as in it's just a big block of stats and you hit face of it, right? And you get other legendaries, so you get Grommash, fits in with Warriors and Rage theme. which they obviously wanted at that point, and charge minions were a big part of Warriors class identity because you had the 1-mana charge card and so on. So Prophet Velen, as it turns out, has like defined its own identity for Priest as an OTK class in some way. Because Velen is like never, ever, ever been played as a 7-mana 7/7, and then you just control the board around it using its, increased healing and damage and such like. The times that Velen has seen play has been in just crazy combos with Mind Blast and Holy Smite and such like.
We're talking about Velen in the main list because it's only just been moved to the Hall of Fame, and Natalie Celine doesn't really have that much to talk about yet because it's not been in the game for long enough. So it makes more sense to discuss Velen with the rest of the class legendaries as it's been in the game for the majority of its cycle.
That's right, and there's a fair bit to talk about as well. So, as I say, Velen has kind of like defined its own class identity, whereas the others, like, for example, the Cleef, which we're about to talk about, often are just synergistic with the class anyway. So, as we've said, Velen was used in a lot of OTK combos. And I think for a long time, the card was just kind of a bit of a joke. No one really played it.
There was a long time it never saw play. I can't remember when it started really seeing play at first. Probably just Razor Priest in Frozen Throne.
Yeah.
Apart from like the occasional weird Priest OTK deck. I think there was one in Ongora that was terrible. It was considered one of the worst classic legendaries, like class legendaries for a long time.
When Knights of the Frozen Throne comes out, and we have the interaction between Shadow Reaper Anduin and Raz of the Chained to give Priest a 0-mana hero power, people started experimenting with different OTKs. And the one that people eventually settled on was Spawn of Shadows. So here's where we're going with this. Because Standard didn't have Spawn of Shadows, Prophet Velen was actually a really viable alternative because of the fact that it doubles the damage of your hero powers. You get multiple hero powers. You can always use Mind Blast, which you can generate additional copies of. And you still have ways to duplicate Prophet Velen, for example, using Mirage Caller and stuff like that. So you have all of these tools now to actually sort of make use of Velen.
It was the win condition of the deck. And Razor Priest in Frozen Throne after the Druid nerfs was the best deck in the game comfortably.
To the point where the meta completely warped around Razor Priest in ways to disrupt it.
The reason Velen was useful was that with exactly Mind Blast and the Holy Smite, you could Hero Power Velen, Hero Power Mind Blast, Hero Power Holy Smite, Hero Power for 30 on the dot.
And even if your opponent is playing like a armor class, for example, Druid, or God help them if they're playing Control Warrior in this meta, right? You've got the 0-mana Anduin hero power. You've got the pressure of the Kazakus potions. You've got so many ways to keep chipping away at the armor that when you come to your OTK turn, you can pretty comfortably just do, like you say, 30 damage and hopefully kill them because you've just been chipping away at them ever since you've got Raza and Anduin online.
It becomes a sort of dance where you try and get your opponent within range, and when you get them in range, they're just dead. Something interesting, after playing Tempo Rogue a lot, I wanted to play some Razor Priest, and I was about to craft Prophet Velen, and I got a golden one out of a Tavern Brawl pack, literally about 5 minutes before I was about to craft it. So
at this point in 2020, Prophet Velen is still a very, very viable option in Razor Priest. Maybe not optimal, but it is certainly viable.
I think Spawn's slightly better, because it just gives you a bit more flexibility. Velen gives you a higher ceiling, gives you a different option, as you say.
Another interesting thing that happened in Knights of the Frozen Throne is the introduction of sort of the Big Priest archetype.
The burn version of Big Priest was not especially good in Standard. It was always just worse than the normal version up until Boomsday, when Zerek's Cloning Gallery got released. I covered Cloning Gallery Priest in some depth in that episode, talking about Malygos. Velen's the other card.
It's probably even more dangerous than Malygos in that deck, actually, as well.
It was what you wanted off of Eternal Servitude, for sure. A classic thing you would do would be find a way of getting double Eternal Servitude and then just go Eternal Servitude, Mind Blast for 20.
That deck certainly resurfaced in Rise of Shadows. When Vargoth came out, the deck's ceiling was suddenly increased, and its flexibility was increased.
Vargoth was released for free to everybody 5 days before the full set was released, and the rotation occurred, which meant that Vargoth was playable in Cloning Gallery Priest for 5 days, and it completely broke the deck. And essentially everybody was in complete outrage, and the subreddit was completely just full of people saying how just awful the deck was, and it was awful.
I've never heard of this.
Oh yeah, it was terrible. What ended up happening was people would just Vargoth and then just resurrect Vargoth a bunch of times and then just Mind Blast, and then Vargoth would Mind Blast them in the face for 30. Yeah, it wasn't nice.
I like how standard players had to be subjected to Big Priest for 1 day. Well, sorry, for 5 days, and they hated it.
Quite a few wild players I remember saying were just like, oh, so now you've realised what we have to deal with.
The other deck that I can think of Velen fitting into is a deck called Mind Blast Priest. And this is essentially a tempo deck, almost always with the dragon package in wild. So Draconid Operatives and, these really strong dragon minions that Priest has access to, like Duskbreaker. Use these minions to generate some mid-game pressure. Sometimes you just win with the dragons, actually. You do an Emperor Thorison, discount on Velen with Mind Blast and maybe Holy Smite when it was back in its old incarnation and being able to hit the opponent in the face. And then you just end the game with this massive damage combo.
I've played in the Call of the Wild tournament a few times, and in one of those I lost to the sort of creator and popularizer of the deck, and I sort of asked for some pointers on it.
Who is that?
Siva. I've got a list up, and it runs like a one-off Divine him and like Acolyte and things like that, and just sort of it's more of a control deck that aims to get Anduin and do shit.
Just to be clear, this isn't a singleton deck. This is a full-on like duplicate deck as well.
Yeah.
Obviously, Blizzard has realised that there is nothing they could really do to the card and keep the same effect and make it so people don't try and do silly OTKs and make it more of a board-focused thing to keep in line with Priest's identity of trying to, or supposed identity of trying to just control the board. Because that's never what Velen was about, and there's not really a way you could change him to make it like that. It's just kind of defined that part of Priest's class identity all by itself, which I find really interesting, but obviously Blizzard disagrees, so they Hall of Famed it, and now it's Wild's problem. Cheers, mate.
Pretty much, yeah.
Edwin Van Cleef, Rogue Legendary, 3 mana 2/2 combo. Gain +2/+2 for every other card you've played this turn.
Wow.
It used to be a 1/1 with stealth.
Wow, what a massive nerf, eh?
We knew how powerful Morose was, right? So
Well, it's just killed the card, hasn't it, really, removing stealth? It's made it unplayable.
It's a real shame. I mean, we keep talking about cards which see no play, and Edwin Van Cleef is the ultimate example.
Right, well...
Is there a standard rogue deck that doesn't play this card?
Not that I know of. I mean, I might have missed one. It's one of the most degenerate cards that's ever been printed. There's nothing really quite like it. It's one of those ones where you can just put it in a deck, and sometimes if you draw it, you just win the game. It's like a 1-card win condition, and it's not really got any real cost to including it, because even if you just play a backstab with it or coin it out, it's still a 3-mana 4/4, and that's great stats.
Yeah, which throws the game's mana stats hierarchy completely out of the window.
Yeah, absolutely.
And obviously you've had to sort of build your deck a little bit around it, but really what rogue deck doesn't want to run backstab or shadow step?
Yeah.
Or go second?
I played quite a bit of Galakron Rogue at the end of Descent of Dragons, and there were quite a lot of games I had where I would open up like on the coin, and I'd open a Van Cleef in my hand, and I'd just be like, well, I guess I'm doing that this game. And sometimes I'd just be able to go like Pharaoh, Cat, Shadow Step, Cat, Shadow Step, Backstab, and then Van Cleef for like 10 or 12 or something.
Yep.
There's some matches that's completely game winning on its own.
Do you know what? It's the exact opposite of Velen. In multiple respects, Velen doesn't support Priest's class identity very well because it just doesn't help control the board. Whereas Edwin Van Cleef is the ultimate epitome of what Rogue is trying to do. And that's use preparation, use backstabs, and get like a really crazy combo going in one turn. Edwin is just like the ultimate payoff since day one.
It's like a payoff card for playing cards that you would want to play in the deck anyway. It's weird, really. It's weird design, if you ask me.
I mean, by all intents and purposes, it's bad, right? It's bad design.
I think it's supremely fortunate to not have been like nerfed, as in properly nerfed. It's one that every time nerfs come around gets talked about, or like the Hall of Fame. And I think it's really lucky to have survived. Like I was talking before about Alex Strasser being occasionally mooted, but not to the extent that Cleef is.
You don't want cards that just, you have to put them in your deck. Like, you must do it in a format, right? You really don't want that to happen. You don't want another Bone Mare, you don't want another Corridor Creeper or anything like that. But Cleef has been that for Rogue, an entire class for years in Standard. Now, as to why Van Cleef wasn't Hall of Famed, this is kind of the reasoning for it. And this is a quote from, is it Chad Nervig?
Yeah.
So, his initial game design for Hearthstone, and to quote, "So, why not rotate him? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, he's really good, but he's also in a class, not neutral, and that goes a long way. Number two, he's also right up Rogue's alley in terms of class identity, which I already said about. Number three, he skews Rogue in general towards playing lots of little cards, but not towards any particular archetype overly strongly. Finally, much of his current power level is dependent upon Year of the Dragon cards. This sort of ebb and flow of expansions is good, not disputing that he's been strong all along, but Year of the Dragon in particular has had really strong synergies for him. And he said that they're going to keep reevaluating it for Hall of Fame and stuff like, but they're going to keep him in Standard for the time being."
Yeah, that's that is. I've not seen that, but that's ropey. The most synergistic cards with Cleef are Backstab and Shadow Step, and they're classic.
Oh, and Prep.
Prep less so nowadays. That doesn't really see much play. I know what you said about the lackeys. That makes sense. Well, like Shadow Step and such. But Backstab and Shadow Step are often going to be in a rogue deck. That's what I was saying before. It's like you get rewarded for putting cards that you would put in the deck anyway if Cleef wasn't around. Rogue's got no early game defense, so it's going to run Backstab. If Rogue's trying to go for resources to combo, it's going to run Shadow Step.
I mean, obviously I'm not a Standard player, but even I'm sort of aware of how prevalent the card is. I mean, for example, in looking for lists for this podcast, I've just been completely flawed as to find lists that don't run him and don't have a good reason for not running him.
I'm just checking the strategy page of the wiki. Because that's always a reliable source of information. But it's just.
Did you know that every card is viable?
I just saw something funny because it literally says, "Be careful when relying on Edwin. If his attack becomes 7 or higher, he can be destroyed by big game hunter." No.
When did that get written? Bloody hell.
When did Big Game Hunter get nerfed? April 2016, Big Game Hunter got nerfed. So that's clearly in there from that point, like way before that point.
Oh, that's great. We should do that more often. We should read from the strategy page because there are some absolute shockers.
There's some rubbish. One thing I would say is that if there was ever a deck that wouldn't play Van Cleef, it's Old Rogue. Because of the lack of the 0 mana cards, you can't really do many combos. But most lists still ran Van Cleef anyway, because it's a 3 mana 4/4 on the coin, just even then.
Yeah.
And that was like the maximum, and very occasionally a 6/6 on turn 5 or something. Even then, when there's basically no synergy, it's like it would still be played a lot of the time.
It's certainly striking that lots of people still ran it, right?
I didn't. I ran King Muckler, but that's a discussion for another day. I can get past the fact that it's so versatile, but the main thing I think that is the issue is the fact that it can just win the game, blow out against matchups that you shouldn't win.
Yeah.
Sometimes you even see it in like big tournaments or something. Like I remember one where someone got Van Cleefed, it's like against a warrior, and then made an 8/8 Van Cleef on turn 1 and lost a favourable matchup. And then the game after that, I think this was when specialist format was about. So it was like 3 warriors versus 3 rogue decks. It's like a bad matchup for the rogue, but 2 out of the 3 games he got cleaved and lost. At that point, you kind of have to look at it and think there's something not quite right there when it's completely skewing games like that.
That has always been a problem with the card as well. Because of Rogue's classic cards being so good, that capability has always been there. And you see people complain about it like all the time.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say. Like Blizzard clearly doesn't want to change the card, so
it's not really fitting with the game, really. Like I like the card, but
it's very, very high rolly, isn't it? I mean,
it's too good.
Other rogue decks that have existed have always used him. So Oil Rogue frequently ran him, not always, but very, very frequently.
Well, even if you go and like prep and something, it's still like a 6/6.
It's interesting what they say, but it doesn't particularly push any rogue type archetype to be so problematic. But that's because the card is so flexible.
Yeah.
That's because it pushes every rogue archetype to be problematic.
You played it in Tempo Rogue as well in Frozen Throne, and that deck didn't used to play many cards a turn. Usually, that was a curve deck, and you still run Cleef.
Oh, yeah.
Even with one card, it's good stats for the cost. So make it a 3-mana 0/0.
Fantastic.
There we go. That'll do it.
Fantastic. It's not like with Malagas where it ebbs and flows. Like, as far as I understand, Van Cleef has always been a prevalent force in Standard.
To my knowledge, I think if Rogue's good, usually Van Cleef's in the deck. There might be some corner cases, but I think for the vast majority of the time, it's always been useful at some point.
For a long time, I only thought this card saw playing Miracle Rogue. And how foolish of me, because then I looked at standard deck lists and saw the Galakron rogues that were happening, and that's not really a Miracle Rogue. It's more of a, more tempo rogue. I thought, bloody hell, they're really pushing this, aren't they? All the 0-mana cards you can create, and I thought, wow.
Apart from Miracle Rogue, it's as good a deck as you can get for Van Cleef. Because if you go like Togwaggle into Galakron, blimey, that's a lot of 0-mana cards. Van Cleef's quite good with 0-mana cards, turns out.
The card is going to have absolutely no problem seeing future play in Rogue, as long as this year keeps as it is and Blizzard doesn't touch Galakron or High Sparrow and Togwaggle, which they probably won't, because they'll probably just nerf Demon Hunter a few more times and then call it a day. So
I'll be surprised if we reach this time next year and Van Cleef hasn't had something done to it, but who knows?
Oh, blimey. That was a lot of cards. As I said, this is probably the last episode that we'll do before uploading any of them. So this section will normally be a feedback section for you to tell us how wrong we were about your favourite card. But for now, it's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye from me. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Stay safe up there. I'm James, and I'm joined by my good friend... Ugh, sorry, I have to do that one again. I'm James.
Oh, God.
Oh, dear.
Professionals, eh?